Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Paws for My Tail podcast. I'm your host, Shepherd the Leopard, or Shep the Snep for short. Today, I'm with the totally cool Wolf TK. TK Wolf.
TK Wolf.
TK Wolf. To kind of give a brief start, what are some of the topics you think we're going to talk about in this series of podcasts? And then what kind of general advisory would you give this podcast? PG, PG-13, something like that.
Some of the things I think we'll be talking about are family, career and motivations, charity, time in the fandom. We will be getting into some topics that I would say are in the PG-13 range, discovery of sexual identity and orientation. We'll probably be touching on some past issues with alcoholism and abuse. And I think that's about it as far as content warnings go.
Yeah. And we'll just tackle the issues as they come. But really excited for this podcast. It's going to be really good.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me here.
TK, why don't you go ahead and give us a little introduction?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a software engineer. I'm currently a game developer. I love video games, and they've been a huge part of my life. I do some dancing on the side. I'm a furry. I've been in the fandom for, I want to say, about 15 years in terms of offline, face-to-face, more direct interactions. And pretty much for like a decade beforehand in terms of just online only, appreciating the art, having a persona. I've also been very invested in doing charity within the furry community.
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and start off? So like TK, tell us about where you grew up, where you were born. What was it like? Where was it at?
So I was born in New York, but I have almost no memories from there. Because before I was 4, we moved to New Jersey. I lived in deep suburbia. So it's a great place to raise kids and a terrible place to do things like have fun, interesting things. But there's plenty of stuff for kids. You know, we had a playground close enough. We had grass and trees. It really was deep suburbia.
Plenty of grass to go and touch.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us about what was your family like growing up? Siblings, mom and dad?
Oh yeah. So I'm a first generation immigrant in my family, which means that of my family line, I'm the first one to be born in the U.S. My dad came from Israel. My mom came from Romania. I think they both met in Israel and at some point got married, came over here, had me and my sister. I have a sister who's 3 years older than me. Generally, we in most ways, I had a very average life. In that, like, things were, we had a house, we were making our payments, we had money for food, we had money for, some fun things here and there. I was a pretty solid student in school. Definitely a weird one. Definitely had my share of oddities. But yeah, my dad was a software engineer. So he worked I think on like banking software. I don't actually know the details of what he did. But he just got into gritty code work. And was able to provide for the family with that. My mom was a Hebrew school teacher and a tutor. And she kind of, they had like a mix between traditional family role, versus not. I think she worked part-time for quite a while rather than full-time. And they sort of found their balance that way. I was absolutely the annoying little brother to my sister. We loved each other very much, but I did irritate her all the time, and it was hilarious for me and only me. No, she's great. She was protective and caring. Yeah, a good bean.
So if your dad was a software engineer back then, those were far less common jobs, and so was there a lot of access to computers growing up? Like, what was that like? Was it any different from like what you noticed from other people in your household because of that factor, or was it pretty much the same?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I don't really know if I have a great gauge to compare myself to what others had at the time. I mean, dating myself a bit here, but I was kind of on the first wave of the internet becoming a household commodity, right? I'm back from the Stone Ages of cell phones were not a thing, the internet was not a thing. You actually had to just go outside or watch TV or something. But my dad definitely was into technology, and he enjoyed sharing that with me. So we had a family computer that was like I think it was a 66 megahertz processor that you could push the turbo button on it, and it goes to 133, and the fan goes. Maybe cut that fan audio out, but anyway.
Oh
yeah,
no!
And you I promise it didn't go boom. Anyway. But yeah, you have the little turbo button that you push it on, and it goes to 133, and you're in mega processor mode. I remember my dad taught me some really early like pseudo coding languages. There's this thing called Logo, where you have this little turtle. It's like almost a dot on the screen, and you tell it these sequences of operations like turn right 90 degrees, go forward 1 unit, turn right 90 degrees, go forward 1 unit. And you basically just draw patterns on the screen. And I didn't really know what I was doing with it, but it did get me like fiddling with stuff and saying, oh, I can change these numbers and things happen and it's cool.
Mm-hmm. Were these the green screen computers where all they really displayed was like text type things, or?
No, it wasn't green screen. I'm pretty sure we had Windows 3.1 at that time. So it was old and slow, but yeah, it did get going. There were pictures on it. You double click the folders to navigate. So pretty close to modern operating systems, just ancient.
So not that dated, but still a little dated.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, dated, but relatable enough. I hope, please.
Mm-hmm. So what was school like growing up? Tell us about like elementary school. Were you just like every ordinary kid? Was there anything fun that you can recall from back way long ago in those days?
So a lot of my memories from that, and by the way, some context, like I have actually lost some memories from, I've murky memories from a lot of that period of time, and we'll get into some of that later. But I do remember that I was certainly an awkward kid. And part of that maybe was ADHD to some degree, maybe was just some level of neurodiversity that I haven't really pinned down yet. But I had a combination of being one, like very, very studious. I remember in first grade, I was skipping ahead, or maybe it was kindergarten, probably that, where we had exercises like draw the number 1 10 times and draw the number 2 10 times. And I got so bored with it, I just got it all done in a couple minutes and went to the teacher and was like, "Can you give me something else? I'm bored." and she started introducing me to like addition, simple arithmetic. But socially, I definitely was an awkward kid. Kids picked up on something about me, and I do remember generally feeling disliked. I do remember generally struggling to connect. Yeah, it was very odd, and I think it fed into something where I would try really hard to be accepted and to be liked, and it would generally backfire. Partially because some things people, they pick up on it. They feel it. When someone's a try hard, especially as a kid, they're unforgiving. And part of it is that, yeah, I was an awkward kid. And I mean, there were some family issues that started surfacing at home since even, I want to say 4 or 5 years old, roughly in that range.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
but did pretty good in school. Your mom was you said a Hebrew teacher or a part-time Hebrew teacher. Did that play into any of that? Did you have pretty good support with your mom, or is it more just your mom was wanted you to succeed and really kind of pushed learning at an early age?
I think it was a mix. It was a mix of a few things. She pushed me to get into Hebrew studies, which frankly I just did not care for at all. I was very stubborn about it. Because I was also a very logically oriented kid. So a lot of the stuff that felt that was religious based or religion based in religion immediately sent these signals in my brain where I'm just like, this is a fairy tale. Why am I treating a fairy tale like history? It's clearly not. And you get into things like rules. Well, we do this because it's what we're supposed to do. Well, that doesn't make sense. Why do we not mix milk and meat? I don't care. It's fine. Like, what, God said so? Who said God said so? Like, like that's the level of argumentative I was. But one of the cool things that I do respect is that my mom did actually encourage that. She encouraged not just blindly following, but discussing. Even though she wouldn't necessarily have answers for all of it. But in terms of the more proper school studies, she definitely pushed me real hard to study. She, I don't know if this is a general immigrant thing, because I do hear about this from other first-gen immigrants, that parents are very strict on study. And I was definitely put on a path of you will study hard in school, you will get A's, you will graduate with a degree and go to a good college, and then you're going to get a good job and you're going to be able to support yourself. Like that was the path forward. That was primary objective through me being raised.
Yeah, you do see that quite a bit in immigrant families. And it might just be because they recognize how important education is to be like an entryway into a lot of paths for their kids. So yeah, that is something, huh?
Yeah. And it's interesting because you don't hear people talking about this much now, but the American dream that, my parents followed coming to the States was America is a place where you can study hard, work hard, get a good job, and provide for your family, right? Like that was the American dream. And that's what my parents came to this country for. That's what they mainly got. And I consider myself really, really fortunate that in general, things have worked out for me in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And we'll definitely be getting to a lot of that kind of where a lot of this kind of ended up and how you're doing now. But back to kind of as you were a kid, so you were just that kind of awkward, very smart, but kind of not really popular kid in school. Did that play out in any kind of weird ways or any kind of different ways? Did you feel like your childhood was pretty good, or was there any kind of issues regarding that as you were growing up?
Yeah, so it does get murky because there are times when I'll look back and say, yeah, I had a great childhood, everything was fine. And there are times when I'll look back and say, yeah, there was a side of duality. And this might be a good time to get into some of this. But I definitely did live a life of duality in that life at home kind of started to become less stable as I was growing up. I did mention that, around 4 or 5-ish, I started noticing issues, right? Like mom and dad would start arguing. I would hear them, yelling at each other through my door. And I think at first it wasn't that big of a deal. Things were okay, even though there was a level of, I think, emotional immaturity or lack of growth for my parents, which made it difficult for me to learn certain skills, right? How to learn healthy conflict resolution and how to deal with more difficult scenarios. And I think it did start to affect me in a few ways, just because you kind of absorb some of these things, right? You absorb the anger, you absorb the hostility, you absorb the tension. And I'm pretty confident that other kids kind of just picked up on that, right? Like I had some anger starting to brew in me. I had distance starting to brew inside of me. And you combine that with being this awkward, nerdy kid, and you become a really easy target for people.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think that, that reflected in a few different ways. I definitely had some friends. I had a very small number of close friends. And like my two childhood best friends got me through so much in life. I can't even express how important it was to have those couple close connections. Because that's what gave me so many happy childhood memories, and what gave me just feelings of comfort, feeling of having playmates, right?
Yeah.
I've always connected with people through play. And yeah, that's kind of been like a recurring theme in my life.
Oh, fun. Well, what kind of ways did you play, like, with your friends? Because that's always fun for me to think back, like, some of the goofy, nerdy things that I did as a kid with my friends. So, like, was there any of that growing up? What kind of things do you recall doing with your friends?
Yeah. So, full nerd on display. There were a few things that I love doing with my friends. One is that one of my besties, his dad got him an NES, which was the coolest thing in the world. The OG Nintendo system. I remember I was probably 5 or 6-ish at the time. And I remember we were watching his dad just play Mario 1, and this was the coolest freaking thing in the world. I've had a few computer games up till then, but they were all very janky, very unstable, would crash half the time, would take 5+ minutes to load. But I'm just watching this game, and it's this polished piece of magic. And I was absolutely enamored by it. I remember once in a while when we got to have a sleepover, we would stay up all right, I'm going to say all night, but by all night, I mean until like 10 p.m. maybe. But we would stay up late and we would play like Bubble Bobble. That was the big one, actually, because it was 2-player co-op. And it was really, really hard, but it was really, really cool. I remember the one time when we finally got not just the ending, but the secret true ending, and we were like dancing around the room and partying. I definitely had a very healthy imagination, a little bit too healthy. We played pretend a lot. So I had an older bestie and a younger bestie. The older bestie would make up stories about it. You know what? Actually, let me roll back a little bit. There's a little bit of context here, because around this time in life, there were also a lot of like video game TV shows that started to come into the media ecosystem, where you had the Super Mario Brothers Super Show, you had the Zelda show, you had Captain N, which was about the awesome gamer who got stuck in the video game and he has to help out all the people with their video game problems. So my bestie would always say, "Oh, one day we're going to go to Videoland where all the video characters are real." And we would have our play around those themes, right? One of them, my older bestie, we would be in the Mario world, and like for whatever reason, Mario and Luigi were the bad guys, and we were with the Koopa kids, and we were gonna stop Mario and Luigi from their evil schemes. And my younger bestie, we were this is a few years later, but in the Genesis era for Sonic, we were Sonic Bros. So we would have our little fantasy things where, we went through a magical portal and we're in this weird Mobius world, and like, whoa, Sonic and Tails, I don't know how we know your name, but we're afraid because we've never seen it. I'm like, yeah. And yeah, but of course, then we become super best friends with the coolest game characters, and that was like a lot of our video game fantasy.
It sounds like you were already RPing as somewhat furry adjacent characters at a young age.
It was RP. We were role playing. We were role playing before we knew what role playing was. God, what is my life?
To get back onto like a more serious note about your life. So you said you were about 5 years old when some of the more like yelling and shouting started happening. as you were going to your friend's place, did you recognize that what was going on in your house wasn't acceptable? Like, did your other friends have that, or was that just something that you just didn't recognize as something that could be harmful, or just something that you just assumed was just something that everybody had and they just kind of kept quiet?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question because I mean the short of it is no, I didn't realize that that was an abnormal thing. Partially because I think it started slow. It started infrequent and kind of slowly became a more progressive, a more frequent thing. It slowly became like bigger and worse over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, you have this sort of slow transition. On the other hand, um, and this does kind of play into the themes of like the duality here, that I built this understanding that the problems, mental issues, anything that was under this sort of bubble of unhealthy, uncomfortable things were things that the families kept kind of within their closed door, right? It was something that you only share with your actual family, real people. Sorry, not real people. With the closest people, right? Like you're in the sphere, it stays there, and you put on a face for the outside world. And yeah, so I didn't. It's not that I expected that other families were also doing the same, but I also, I guess, probably assumed that if it did, it was just a normal thing. And yeah, you have your normal face, and then you have the veil off when you're at home.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean it got rough. It definitely got really rough. Because over the years, as things kind of progressed with that, and I don't know exactly, at what year it got to one spot or another. I remember the start. I remember at its worst. But it did progress to a point where the arguments started being between more than just my mom or dad. They started originating from more benign or trivial things that would just set off like eruptive anger or an emotional, like an emotional breakdown of crying and sobbing and being blamed for being the source of the crying. And it did become a place where home was no longer the place that was, it was no longer the place that is usually good and sometimes bad things happen. It is the place where you just are tense and are anxious and are stressed and are in high alert. Like I started developing a hypersensitivity to the emotions of people around me as kind of a defense mechanism to try to read people and not set them off.
Yeah.
And those are things that carried into the world around me as well, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a kid, you kind of start to learn, especially in your family settings, like what things trigger your parents. And so I think that you do kind of start to learn ways to kind of reduce that because it's traumatic for you. Like that's an experience nobody wants to have. And so it sounds to me like you probably got to where you started anticipating the needs of your parents in order to help keep at least some monochrome of peace as much as you could in the home. What does that kind of do to a kid? What did that do to you? Did it make you not want to be at home? Did it kind of make you feel like you kind of closed yourself off in a lot of ways? Kind of, do you remember any feelings that, or any things that you did because of that environment that you were in?
So it's very nebulous, for this one, because there are so many different instances that would occur. There could be different triggers. There could be different reasons. Ultimately, it did cause me to start feeling very repressed, to keep things to myself, mixed in with things that were arguments. There was also just there was a lot of really, really harsh criticism. On my dad's side, things that weren't masculine enough would not just be criticized, but made fun of, right? Like he would call me a ninny or a fag or a little baby girly, like literally that level of a high school bully, like mocking how I throw a football. Or, on my mom's side, it would there was a combination of just criticism in general, being very hard to please, but also nitpicking things like, you shouldn't be watching that show. That's for kids. You can't like that. Saying to like a 10-year-old watching a cartoon. And it became difficult to have anything that I was even allowed to like or be joyful about. And not to paint a completely drastic and unrealistic picture. Like, I was allowed to play games. I got into Yu-Gi-Oh! At some point. You know, I was able to do things, but it would come with this side of feeling like it was begrudgingly accepted versus encouraged. So there was that side. And there was also, just this feeling of walking on eggshells, right? Building a mindset where the expectation is that everyone around you is just at just near the boiling point, right? And people, maybe because they're in public, you know, at school, someone might not go to the point of snapping at me and freaking out. But if we were alone together, I don't know how that would go. Or or just knowing or feeling, and not knowing isn't the right word, thinking that someone under the surface is just has seething rage for me, or just disgust for me, or contempt, whatever it was, just imagining magnified responses to almost anything I could do, and usually imagining the worst possible thing that it could be. So a lot of base level anxiety.
Well, it sounds like your dad and your mom to some extent would constantly, you know, everything you did came with some kind of critique. And so I'm sure that spilled out not just in the home, but as you went everywhere else, you know, with your interactions with other people outside of the home, just constantly feeling like everything you were doing was being judged in some way, or that you weren't meeting expectations that, you know, even strangers, you know, that would have for you. Did you feel that at all? Did that kind of feeling of not being good enough or not being what your parents wanted at all times, did that bleed into other facets of your life?
I'm not sure. I think to some extent, I'm sure it did. There were some people that I felt safe with. Like the small group of friends that I had, I just felt safe with them. Things were good. Teachers, I generally felt safe with. I generally felt like I could trust. Other school kids, I think I was just in general, I don't know. I think there was just a combination of not knowing what to say, not knowing what to do, not feeling like I could relate because anything I would be interested in would be uncool, right? So I think just a general difficulty with connecting. And granted, there were still, and this is one of the most difficult things about thinking about my childhood, is that alongside these really difficult things, there were still really great things too. Like, my dad took taekwondo with me and my sister, and we did that
cool.
we did that for 5 years. And partially it was because I did have some discipline issues in schools, and that whipped me into shape, not through fear, but just because it was definitely a more, I mean, it was like strict and regimented, but not in a cruel way at all. You know, you have your respect for your teacher, like, sir, yes, sir. And it was just also just a great bonding experience, because I mean, me and my dad and sister, we all got to do something physical together. We got to have this element of growing and getting stronger. And I loved it. Not to mention, I also loved Power Rangers back then. So anything that was like, wow, I can actually, like, I can fight, was cool. And it was exciting, and it was really empowering. Like, I would not be bullied. I would be bullied in the sense of people might pick on me in the sense of shaming me or putting me down. But in the few cases where someone got to the point of threatening, I would turn on a dime, not bringing it to violence, but I would be like, no, you want to fight me? Fight me. Throw the first punch. And I got into a few scraps. Nothing major. Anything that happened was broken up by a teacher probably within a minute or two. But also, I never got into a fight with the same person twice because they like not. And that's not to say like, oh, I beat them up. Like, no, like we were still kids fighting, but enough that I could hold my ground and not be threatened. So it was nice to have that under my belt. But of course, some of the underlying motivation of why I was so strongly against bullies is because I lived with one. So it's like, well. Mixed bag there.
Well, and it sounds like your biggest bully was the bully you came home to, really.
Yeah. And again, it's so difficult to think about these because it is someone who I would say 19 times out of 20, or whatever percentage, some small percent or some large percentage rather, things would be fine and great. It was when you flip that switch that things got messed up.
Yeah.
Because things never got physical, thankfully. But at its worst, and this is getting closer to around 11, 12 years old. At its worst, there were times when people would be like screaming at each other, running to their door or running to their room, slamming the door so hard like the house shakes. There was one instance where my dad kicked my door in because I dared to lock it when we were in the middle of a fight. And like that was pretty messed up. So it was just an unsafe and unstable environment where you never knew what things could turn into.
Yeah.
Which led to just this duality of things are generally fine and good. I'm enjoying life. I'm having happiness. I'm having good experiences, and I'm crying myself to sleep at night at the same time. So, it's weird. It's weird to look back on that.
Yeah. Did you kind of convince yourself that it was okay? Because you did say 9 out of 10, 19 out of 20 experiences were good. So did you kind of convince yourself that those 1 out of 10 or those 1 out of 9 or 20 experiences, well, it just, not a big deal. These things just happen. Instead of actually recognizing that those were harmful experiences?
So I definitely knew that they were bad. I didn't know what normal was. I didn't have a frame of reference. I do remember I was at the point where I was looking at shows on TV, that family related shows, where I would think, oh, well, that's so fake. Families aren't like that. Families don't talk through a problem. They don't discuss a solution in a way to make things better. They just explode. This is garbage fantasy. So I think it's not so much that I convinced myself as much as I just didn't know what normal was.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of, the fish in water. This is the water.
So this family situation at home, did anything come of that? There was a lot of yelling. Lots of times when there's a lot of yelling, people try to figure out ways to fix the problem. They make changes. Did anything like that ever occur?
So there were a few things. Like there were attempts within the family to try to talk things through at times, right? Like they never really went anywhere great, but they never really made big meaningful changes, or they get better for a bit and then worse for a bit. But yeah, my dad did get to a point where he wanted a big change. Because I think one of the underlying things here also is that he was busting his butt at work to make ends meet, but hated his job. It was sucking the soul out of him. And I definitely empathize with that side as well.
Well, no, that's important to mention. Like, that's not a thing to gloss over, because lots of times there's reasons why people act out, why people feel frustrated, and it bleeds into home. I think that's good to kind of consider those kinds of things. Like, it doesn't justify what your dad did, but as you're kind of getting older and you kind of realize what life is like, you kind of can understand a little bit, not to justify it, but it does give you a little understanding about maybe the stresses your dad was going through as well that might have caused some of those actions.
It does. Yeah, absolutely. Because again, yeah, he worked really hard and hated his job. He wasn't getting the recognition he deserved. He wasn't really progressing. He was definitely feeling stuck in there. And you combine that with the fact that I think at their core, my mom and dad just weren't really compatible with each other, which is fine, right? That happens to a lot of people. But yeah, there was one point when he just made a decision, and actually I'll get into a little bit behind this. Being a first generation immigrants, like our family was the four of us. That was it, right? And I remember feeling a mix of like sorrow and jealousy when I would hear friends, saying, "Oh, it's Christmas time, and we have the whole family here, and the whole family's like 20 people or something." You have the aunt, and you have the uncle, and you have nephews, and you have all this big family. But we were kind of isolated in this little bubble. I think that was behind when my dad made this really big announcement to the family that he decided we're all moving to Israel. And this was when I was at the time when he announced it, I was in 6th grade. I did not speak Hebrew. Like, wow. I knew a few words, a few phrases, but I was 100%, I was American. I was born there. I spoke English. I hung out, with my friends there. So I spoke no Hebrew at all. I did not know anything about the culture other than maybe a couple times when we took a trip to see extended family. And I'm sure he and my mom had many arguments over this beforehand. But ultimately he made that decision that we're all moving. And that was what happened. In fact, I didn't even get my summer break. He said, "No, Mike, you're moving with me first, and then Mom and your sister will come after the summer."
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that? Because your dad was already the one that kind of, from what I'm gathering, was the one that was causing you the most stress as a kid. Mm-hmm. And to be singled out as the one to go just with your dad early, to have nothing but dad time in a new country you hadn't lived in before. What was going through your mind? How are you feeling about that?
I mean, the biggest thing and kind of the only thing that was on my mind at that point was just that I didn't want to go. Right. It was terrifying because I mean, I was struggling socially in school. So there wasn't that. No, even with that, I was still connected to being in school around the people I knew. I was very connected to the small group of friends I had. And just to the life that I had. I didn't want to just go off somewhere new. I will say that like during that time he was doing a little bit better in terms of being more on the encouraging side and more on the supportive side. But ultimately he was very quickly becoming the villain in my mind, right? Because it was his will that was pushed on the family saying, we're all going here.
Yeah.
And I didn't even get my last summer to have proper goodbye time with my friends, And yeah, it was, oh my God, it's a big change.
Yeah. How was that move to Israel? You packed your bags, you went with your dad, strange new place, different country you visited maybe a few times, but obviously, I mean, you mentioned that it probably was a bit of a culture shock and you didn't understand the language.
Yep.
Doesn't sound like the easiest situation to be in.
No, I mean, it was a train wreck. It was very much square peg round hole situation, like trying to force something that isn't going to happen. Because especially at that age, not a good time for big changes. But some of the things that were just really big and really different were, I mean, for starters, I couldn't communicate with people. Like I was in school and I could not communicate with any of my classmates. I couldn't communicate with most of my teachers. I even in math, which is more based on numbers and symbols, that's international. Even that I couldn't do because half of the questions were written questions. And I remember failing tests because like the teacher would in very broken English try to explain to me what the question was, and I wouldn't understand it. I started failing all of my classes. They had this new program that they started introducing in middle school for English speakers, because there were some. But all they did was they had all of the English speakers from all different grades in one tiny little classroom with a volunteer teacher who had a really loose agenda of what to cover. And things were either stuff that I already knew, or things that were beyond me, or things that just weren't relevant. And it got to the point where I literally dropped out of school.
Oh, wow.
Because what was the point? I was failing everything. I couldn't understand. I wasn't learning. There was literally no point.
And that's a stark contrast, because you went from the kid that was excelling in math of all topics, you were a grade ahead in certain areas, so you were like the super academic achiever in the States. And then as soon as you moved to another country, to Israel, it just crumbled, it sounds like. And that, like, how does that make the person who's a lot of your probably confidence and it was tied to your academic achievement at that point, to go from that to then a complete failure, pretty much? Like, what does that do? How are you feeling about all of that?
Bad. Pretty bad. Because there's also there's a side of this as well that we hadn't really talked on much, but I was definitely an overachiever. And part of that is also being able to be someone who brought good things to the family, right? Someone who brought successes to the family, someone who brought just, positive things, who was helping show that, we're going forward in the right direction. That just crumbled. It went down the drain. So I don't remember too many like specific instances that I could point out to, other than just generally feeling utterly depressed, like a constant state of either anger or depression, or trying to escape it.
So like, what did that look like? So you're in Israel. You probably hadn't gotten too many friends at that point. You maybe had some cousins or some relatives which you had moved there to be with, but you come home from school, and what is life like at home when you're not doing well in school, but your mom is very school focused, but you're just not succeeding? Like, how do you remember any of just the feelings or like what it was like coming home from school when that was kind of going on?
I will be honest, this is a period where I frankly have lost a lot of my memories. And part of that is just because my memory sucks in general. But I remember that it wasn't very long, and I'm going to guess on the order of a few months, but it wasn't very long before my parents ended up getting a divorce.
Oh, wow.
Which frankly was the best thing that could have happened for all of us. But at the time was the worst thing that could have possibly happened, right? Because a divorce was something I didn't even understand. It was something that I experienced only through TV shows where the kid hears about their parents divorcing and they say, "No, you can't," and they stomp away. And that's exactly what I did when I heard that they were divorcing, because that was the only way I knew how to react. But inside, I don't want to say I felt nothing, but I didn't even know what I was feeling. And it was rough, man. The only things that really brought me solace in that time, and I'll also before moving to Israel too, like games were still huge for me. Games were like the one thing where you could you are the good guy, you can be a good person and do good things and help people, and things work out. You have fun, you have challenge, you can fail and it's okay, and you get better. Like, all of those things were such a important constant source of joy in my life. And like I'm really glad that I was able to bring my video games with me. So I think I definitely retreated into that quite a bit. Or more so than usual.
When you're that age, typically your parents are probably shielding you from a lot of the whys on why that's happening. But as you've gotten older and as you've talked to maybe your parents about it, have they shared any insights about why that happened, or what ultimately led them to that decision and how that impacted you?
Yeah, so I think as I got older, I pieced some things together, but really at the core, they were just I mean, it was an abusive relationship, right? And I'm going to put a caveat in here because abuse is typically seen as something where there is malicious intent, or there is deliberate actions of control. Well, there were some deliberate actions of control. Anyway, it was not good. Obviously, it was unhealthy. The most forefront factor was my mom was fighting to get me and my sister back to the States, because obviously it was horrible for me. My sister didn't do much better adjusting. She knew a little more Hebrew than me, so it was a little worse for her, but she still hated it.
Yeah.
Granted, there's a whole side thing here, by the way, that while me and my dad had a more strained relationship, my sister and her mom had a more strained relationship. So we had this sort of like this cross going through where both me and my sister were going to go with my mom or my dad, right? And my sister was closer with my dad. I was closer with my mom. Both of us hated Israel. So yeah, that was its own axis of contention that I can get to later. But yeah, I don't think my parents ever really were able to articulate much beyond that. But it did become very clear for me as an adult that, like, my mom's mannerisms, the fact that she doesn't care for a lot of the things that made my dad happy, was probably a real big bummer on him. The fact that my dad had really bad anger issues, obviously, and turned to alcohol for a while, was really unhealthy for my mom. So it's pretty clear as daylight why they broke up. The nuances of like probably where things were around the ages of between probably 1 and 5 for me, that I don't really know, other than what I've sort of made some guesses at. And also being a parent is hard, right?
Yeah.
And I will say again, like I'm like 99% sure I'm not neurotypical. And I'm sure that I was a strain as well. And like saying this now, I also am remembering there were a lot of feelings of guilt. Oh shit.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I just got hit by, I completely forgot how deeply guilty I felt for a lot of it. They never blamed me for it. In fact, I was probably told to the contrary. But I know there was a big part of me that could tell how my awkwardness and my difficulties in life made it harder to be a parent. And it strained the relationship. It definitely did. I know that they don't blame me. I know that they haven't blamed me, but it is an undeniable fact that it made it harder.
Yeah.
And part of that is what you accept as being a parent, as being an adult. Things won't go your way. But yeah, that was really, really difficult to have on my chest in addition to everything else.
Yeah. Lots of times I see parents, they have what they want in their children. And that's kind of, a lot of times parents will, rather than embracing who their child is and focusing on that, they will steer their child to their ideals, what they kind of want to see in that kid. And I know your dad, lots of times, as you said, he made comments like, I forget exactly the terms, but like, just using gay terminology as a way to dismiss some of your behaviors or some of the things that you liked. Do you feel like that kind of instilled a lot of that guilt and shame, knowing that maybe you weren't amounting to what your dad wanted? Your dad probably wanted the more manly son, the maybe more into sports or things that he was into. Did that kind of weigh on those feelings of guilt and shame at all, because you just weren't amounting to what you felt like your parents wanted?
I think indirectly, perhaps. I think that was, I don't remember really feeling like I didn't amount to what they wanted me to be. At least in a context that was responsible for, the divorce. But there was generally feelings of shame, that me in my natural state was not what anyone wanted to see in life. Like, you know, so there was definitely an element of feeling like the way to survive in life was to put on a mask of what is expected of you and to be that. And there may be times and places when you can take that off. But generally, people want what they want, right? Like, gay was a thing that was bad, right? I didn't know what it was. I hadn't even begun to examine or really develop a sexuality at that point, right? Because I was, really young. But I knew gay was bad. I knew I shouldn't be that. I knew I shouldn't be girly. I knew that real men, stayed strong and they didn't cry, and they were the emotional rocks of the family. And I knew that, girly guys were to be mocked and ridiculed. And like, I definitely had a lot of internalized homophobia. I mean, on the side, there were also just regional issues where, like, frankly, racism is obviously a big problem today. It was even worse then.
Yeah.
Like, I had been fed lots of negative stereotypes across the board. Name any religion, any race, any gender. I have been given negative stereotypes about it, other than what I was supposed to be. And it did also paint this very rigid world picture, right? Guys do this, girls do this. This is okay. This is not okay. And it was very much a shared worldview. Well, in my mind, it was a shared worldview. And I think more so than it is today, because now, for all the good and bad that it's brought to the world, things like social media, and just the internet in general, it gives so many more people the chance to have their voice heard and their stories heard. When, like, again, back growing up as a kid, internet generally wasn't a thing. Social media did not exist, period. You saw what was on the media. You saw what was on, Fox News, NBC, whatever you happen to see. But it's a very limited and very tailored view of what you're allowed to experience from what it actually exists in the world. And when you combine with that, the fact that people who are in the minority, at least those who had the, I guess I'll call it the fortune to be able to mask what didn't fit in the box, right? They would be silent about it. I mean, if you're black, you can't hide the fact that you're black, right? Yeah. You're going to have to face that racism head on. If you're queer, you can shrink into a box and hide it, right?
Yeah, you can put that mask on that. Oh, I'm just like everyone else. Haha, I'm I play sports. I like girls. When it's a lot of it is not outward showing. You're right. Like, you can hide a lot of that. You can play the role of the chameleon where you just blend in. But what does that kind of do to you as you're growing up? Like, if you're not being genuine to yourself, there's still a lot of strain, a lot of internalized self-guilt and self-hate and self-shame, it sounds like, that you were feeling. Did that result in just depression or just not feeling happy about how things were? Is there anything that you can look back now and kind of be like, I can see that now?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, it was, I don't even need to look back on it now. Like, I think I knew very well in the time, that I felt awful about myself. For the most part, other kids my age didn't like me. I had all these, like, failings or failing to meet expectations from home. It was really hard to find anything that I was proud of about myself. And yeah, I was dealing with really, really heavy depression from probably late preteens through most of my teenage years. It was just it was a dark place. And it's weird because when you do put the mask on, parts of it feel natural, right? Like I'm not, while I'm more readily willing than most people to put my heart on my sleeve. A lot of what we do in regular society is some degree of masking, right? Like you're hanging around a bunch of casual friends. There's some topics you're going to share and some topics you won't.
Yeah.
And again, at that time, I didn't even know what sexuality was. All right, let's scratch that. That's not true.
But it was more behaviors, it sounds like, or interests than it was actual like sexuality side at that point.
Yeah, I think in general, there was just a feeling of needing to mold to people's expectations, and that was the only way you could be loved, right? If you let those cracks show through, you will be rejected. That was sort of the frame in my mind. So on the one hand, while I was able to hide from it, it just kind of became internalized. It became guilt. It became shame. It became lack of confidence.
Yeah. And it sounds like you, like many others, came from a household where love was conditional rather than unconditional, where you felt, and maybe not entirely, but you felt like you had to meet certain conditions, hit certain criteria to obtain a certain degree of love and acknowledgement from your family or your peers.
Yeah, I mean, well, I would say that for my house, like love was unconditional, both from my mom and from my dad. It was unconditional love, but criticism was always on the table. that was fair game. So it was, it was definitely this push and pull. Like, I love you, but don't be a wuss. Not that those exact words were said, but it was definitely that feeling.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, cool that they, you felt that love.
Yeah.
So we'll get to kind of how furry changed a lot of that in another episode. For the remainder of this one, you're in Israel. Your parents just had a divorce. Your mom wanted to move the kids back to the United States. Kind of walk us through up until like high school. What happened, from that point of being in Israel, your parents divorced. Kind of walk us through the rest of that.
Yeah. So in Israel, like the divorce process was really messy. Because on the one hand, you have a divorce, and you also have wanting to change countries. And I mean, from my dad's perspective, he was fighting to keep me and Sharon as his kids, right? For all the things that he, did wrong and screwed up, he still loved us. He still wanted us to be in his life. And he was now facing this side of, like, my wife is going to leave and take my kids and I won't see them again. So they had some bitter court battles. And while I wasn't present, I wasn't in the courtroom or anything, I was certainly hearing a lot of stuff on the side of it. Like, me and my sister were not well shielded from the process.
Yeah.
So there was that and its whole side thing. My mom found a job that she could take on the side. So she was, and also my dad had moved out a few weeks before the divorce. And so she was basically already a single mom at that point. So now I am not in school, and my mom is out of the house all day, and my dad is out of the house all day. My mom was able to get textbooks from my middle school back in the States. And I actually just started teaching myself. I tutored myself most of sixth grade learnings to not have to get held back a year when I eventually returned. Yeah. I think at some point I got a tutor to help with like English and essay writing, because writing essays was the most intimidating thing I could think of in my life. Actually, going back a bit, when I was in first grade, the teacher every month or couple of weeks would give someone a report that they had to do. And I didn't know at the time, my little 6-year-old brain didn't realize that everyone would eventually get picked. So every time when the teacher was saying, and this next report is going to be, I'd go like this inside my head and be like, no, not me, not me, not me, not me, not me. And the one time, and when it was me, I just started bawling in class because I was so scared and I was so intimidated. And I was like, I don't know how to write a report. What am I going to do? But yeah, writing was a difficulty for me. You might be a little familiar with this from some of the pre-questionnaires I filled out and how long I spent getting that ready.
So just to pull the curtain away, before we do these interviews, I ask a series of questions and kind of help us get prepped so that we can remember, parts of your life that we want to talk about. And TK wrote a short novel to prep for the interview.
I try.
So you did a lot of studying in order to get where you could get caught back up. I assume that, your mom and you and your sister made that move back to New Jersey where you had lived before. Same house, same neighborhood, different neighborhood. Were you able to get right back into things, or was there still a bit of a transition there?
So it was, we did move back into the same house.
Wow.
Because I think what happened was that they had rented the house on a 1-year contract. And so therefore, when we moved back, we were able to move back into the same house, which was really huge because having to also be in like a new neighborhood or something would be better than being stuck in Israel, but still, still a pretty big change. Oh, actually, there is a side note here. One of the things that had me so terrified about living in Israel was the fact that if you live in Israel, you have to go to the army by law.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Every single person. I think it is that if you are an Israeli citizen and you live there for at least 1 year, you are obligated after high school, or if you get into college, after college, to serve in the army for 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So even if you had only lived there for a year, even if you'd moved back to the States, you were still legally obligated to come back.
I could be summoned back to Israel to go to the military. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm 95% on that last bit. But for sure, if I stayed there, I would have had to. And I hated the concept of military. Even though at the time, a lot of it was from like Saving Private Ryan, right? Like just seeing war as hell on earth and generally really hating violence and the thought of killing people, much less being told to kill someone by order of someone else, whether I believed in it or not. That was absolutely terrifying to me. And granted, most of the people who had to go to the military would, they would do their basic training and they would usually do things that are serving within the state, right? Like you're on patrol duty and make sure that there's no bomb threats, which by the way was a daily thing we had to live with as well.
Wow.
So all of that was in the sidelines of this, like my mom taking the bus to work saying, I hope she'll come back today. Because you would read in the newspaper like once a week, there'd just be a bus bombing.
Wow.
So that's just on the side of all that too.
You lived in Israel. You made the move back to the same home, which was amazing. Picked back up. Did you have any issues getting back to the grade that you were supposed to be in? You said that you had done all that studying. It sounds like it went smoothly, but were there any hiccups at all, or did it go pretty well?
So generally it was a huge improvement, right? Because the main source of anger and pain and tension had been removed. Granted, we still had arguments in the house. Mental health was still like pretty like down here across the board. But it was the starting point of healing.
Yeah.
Granted, I did. Well, first to answer the question more directly, getting back into school, like yes, I was able to stay at the same grade. I was able to stay 1 year ahead in math. There definitely were some knowledge bits that I missed. I missed geography. So if you're asking me to name the states, I will fail harder than anyone else.
Don't worry. No, everybody struggles with that unless you're that one person.
Name all 50 states. Go in the comments. But generally, I was able to jump back in pretty well. On the side of this, though, I, having been removed from that situation and being away from my dad, I didn't know that there was a word for this, but I disowned my dad. I stopped. I did not respond to any letters, any messages, anything, because at that point in my life, he was the villain that made that whole traumatic year happen. And even though it was a shared failing, in my mind at the time, he was the source of the arguments, and it was his fault.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but it was, even though it was really hard on everyone, it was the starting point of when things could heal. Because I remember overall, I was so happy to be back. I was so happy to be able to talk to people. I mean, just the fact that like I didn't have to be afraid to speak to a person. You know, I could buy something in the store and not struggle to communicate. I was happy to take classes again. I was still the weirdo. I mean, I was definitely still, I still wasn't popular in school. Like middle school was the lowest of my social standing in life, let's say. But it was definitely the start of things getting to a better place. And high school things started to really take some positive turns for me.
Oh, good. Well, let's go ahead and we'll stop there, because I think that we've kind of gotten out of the way a lot of like the groundwork. And maybe, I know you're a super positive person, so it's probably difficult to like kind of go into a lot of like the nitty gritty, some of the less positive things. But I think it really does help lay a foundation of where we're going to end up going, where, you know, your life does improve. You run into furry circles and some other things that we'll get into. But I think this has been a really good kind of laying the foundation of where TK comes from and kind of where you go from here. So if that's okay with that, we'll end this episode. And we'll come back and we'll go from there. We'll start going into high school and college and kind of where furry starts to come into play. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I mean, that sounds great to me. I think, hey, if everyone who's listening in, you've made it through the worst.
So if you've made it through the worst, go ahead and hit the like and or subscribe button. No,
I mean, there are definitely still some struggles ahead, but there a lot of good stuff comes into.
So we're excited to have you join us for the next episode. Stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next episode. See you, everyone.
Wah.